The prairie doesn't forgive you for stopping. It moves whether you do or not, the grass bending in long, slow waves, the sky doing its enormous, indifferent work overhead, the wind carrying seeds from places you'll never see to places you'll never go. A man can stand at the edge of his own land and feel smaller than the distance between fence posts. That's what the prairie does. It puts you in proportion. Callum Bryce had been in proportion for 11 years. He stood at the kitchen window of the homestead his father had built, and his father's father had wanted, watching the frost come off the field the way it always did in October. Reluctantly, in patches, the way a person gives up something they've been holding too long. He was 53 years old. He had a working furnace, a truck that started most mornings, and a daughter in Saskatoon who called on Sundays when she remembered. There had been a wife, Marion. There had been the plan for more children. The house had 4 bedrooms for a reason. There had been a kitchen that smelled like something other than coffee, and whatever could be made from what was left. Then the cancer came through quietly, the way the worst things do, and Marion was gone before the crocuses came up the following spring. The children who might have filled those rooms became the rooms themselves, empty, clean, undisturbed. Callum had buried the plan beside the intention. In the part of himself he stopped visiting. That was 11 years ago. The ranch had not grown quieter after that, exactly. Quiet suggests a before. What descended on the Bryce property on the road east of Moose Jaw was something more complete than quiet. It was the particular stillness of a place that had decided it was finished being inhabited by more than one person. His neighbors had made their peace with this conclusion. Callum Bryce, they agreed over coffee at the co-op, was the kind of man who had done his grieving and come out the other side with nothing left he wanted to do with the time remaining. He was not unkind. He was not difficult. He was simply done. He was filling the wood stove that Tuesday morning in late October when he heard a vehicle on the road. He didn't look up at first. Nobody came out this far without having gotten lost, and being lost, in his experience, was not something people thanked you for pointing out. But the sound slowed, then stopped, at his gate, then a knock at the door, 3 even, unhurried. The knock of someone who had decided, somewhere on the drive out, that they were not going to be nervous about this. He opened the door. She was young, 26, 27 at the outside. Standing on his step in a canvas jacket that had done a season's work already, her dark hair pulled back under a worn wool toque. She had the kind of stillness that doesn't come from ease but from practice. A duffel bag sat on the step beside her boots, which were steel-toed and serious. She was holding a manila envelope in both hands the way you hold something you've been trusted with. She looked at him the way you look at a door you're not sure will open. "Mr. Bryce," she said, not a question. "Yes, my name is Vera Lonechild." She paused in the way of someone who has learned to give people a moment to arrange their response. "My grandfather was Joseph Lonechild. You knew him as Joe." Callum felt the name land somewhere old inside him. Joe Lonechild. 13 years ago, before Marion's diagnosis and the long, slow rearrangement of everything, Callum had worked 2 seasons with Joe on a fencing contract up through the Cypress Hills. They had eaten lunch on the same tailgate, shared a thermos of terrible coffee, argued about hockey in the way of men who are actually agreeing about something else. He hadn't seen Joe in 9 years, not since Marion's funeral, where Joe had stood at the back in his good shirt and said nothing, which was exactly right. "Joe's dead," Callum said. "It wasn't a question. Stroke, 4 months ago." Her voice was even, in his sleep, the way he would have wanted. He looked at her for a long moment, the envelope, the duffel, the boots that meant she intended to work. "He sent you here, before he died." She looked at the envelope, then back at him. "He said you'd probably tell me to go away. He wasn't wrong. He said to tell you that a man who stops building things is a man who's made peace with falling apart." She said it without apology. "And that you owed him." "What did I owe Joe Lonechild?" She held out the envelope. "He said the answer's in here," she said, "and that you'd know it when you read it. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something. Where are you listening from today?" Drop it in the comments, a city, a province, a country, whatever feels right. It means something to know where this voice reaches. Now, let's go back to that doorway because what happens next is the part that stays with you. He read the letter at the kitchen table while she stood just inside the door, not quite committed to the room. Joe's handwriting was large and deliberate, the handwriting of a man who had taught himself cursive from a library book at age 34 and never quite trusted the letters to hold still. Callum, if you're reading this, Vera made it out there and you didn't turn her away at the gate, which means some part of you is still paying attention to something other than the weather. Good. Her name is Vera Lonechild. She's my daughter's girl. Her mother left when Vera was 3 and I raised her from then. She knows cattle, fencing, and equipment well enough to run a place half again the size of yours. She is also stubborn in the particular way of people who have been underestimated long enough to stop being surprised by it. Here is what she doesn't have. A place that will take her on without making her prove herself every morning before she's had her coffee. She went to agricultural college in Lethbridge. She graduated second in her class. She has applied to 11 positions in 3 provinces. She has been offered none of them. I'm not asking you to fix that. I'm asking you to give her a season's work on your terms, fair wages, the spare room, and the chance to do what she was trained for. After the season, if she wants to go, let her go. If she wants to stay, let her choose. You told me once, coming down out of the Cypress Hills with the sun behind us, that the worst thing about the place was that it was too big for one person. I told you it wasn't too late to change that. You said it was. Callum, I am asking you one more time. Prove me wrong. Joe Callum folded the letter. He looked at Vera, who had not moved from the space between the door and the room. He had no right, Callum said. No, she agreed. He didn't. A pause. I'm not here for sympathy, and I'm not here to be a project. I'm here because I know how to work, and I need a place that'll let me. 1 season, fair wages. That's the whole arrangement. The wind pressed against the kitchen window. Outside, the field lay flat and gray gold under the October sky, going nowhere. Callum stood up slowly. There's a spare room at the end of the hall, he said. Heat works in there. Supper's at 6. He moved toward the door, then stopped with one hand on the frame. One thing, he said without turning around. I don't talk about Marion. Not to neighbors, not to my daughter, not to anyone. He paused. I just need you to know that going in. He went outside. Vera looked at the letter still on the table. Joe hadn't mentioned Marion at all, which meant Callum had offered the warning to someone who hadn't known to ask. She understood, standing in that kitchen with the wood stove ticking beside her, exactly how much weight a man could carry without letting it show in his posture. She put the kettle on. The first 2 weeks were constructed entirely of practical things and careful distances. Vera was up before 5 without being asked. She assessed the fencing along the north field on the first morning and spent the next 3 days replacing it properly. Not the field repairs Callum had been doing for years, post pulled, wire tightened and left, but a real line, plumb and solid, the kind that tells the cattle the conversation is finished. She found the issue with the tractor's hydraulics on day 4 and fixed it with parts she'd brought in her duffel, which Callum noticed but did not comment on. She reorganized the equipment shed according to a logic that became apparent after she explained it once, which he acknowledged with a single nod. She cooked in the evenings, straightforward food, nothing that asked to be admired, just things that were hot and good and ready at 6. Once, she made bannock from a recipe Joe had taught her, and the smell of it filled the kitchen in a way that was not entirely comfortable for either of them. Callum watched her the way you watch a change in the weather, carefully, from a distance, trying to determine what it would mean for the work ahead. She was not what he'd expected, though he hadn't known what he'd expected. She was quiet, but not closed. She asked practical questions and gave practical answers. She didn't try to fill the silences, and she didn't seem to need him to. They were building something out of the careful exchange of necessary information, and neither of them reached past it. On the 16th day, Callum was on the roof of the equipment shed, replacing a section of corrugate that had been losing the argument with the wind since August. The ladder shifted. He caught the eave on the way down, enough to slow it, not stop it. He hit the frozen ground hard on his left side and lay there looking up at the white October sky while his body held its own inquiry. Vera appeared. She crouched beside him. "Can you feel your hands?" He could. "Move your right foot." He did. "You're not broken," she said. She stayed where she was. "You're also working alone on an icy roof at 7 in the morning without telling anyone, which is a decision I'd like to understand." "I've been doing this alone for 11 years, he said. "I know," she said. She helped him up. "That's not a recommendation." He pulled his arm back. She didn't react. But for the rest of that afternoon, he was aware of exactly where she was on the property, with a precision he hadn't applied to another person in a very long time. At supper, they didn't speak about it. But the silence between them had shifted slightly on its axis, and they both felt it without naming it. It started with the northern lights. They came out on a night in November. Not the faint suggestion you sometimes get over the fields, but the real thing, green and moving and slightly frightening the way beautiful things can be when they're too large to look at comfortably. Callum had been on the step for 20 minutes before he heard her door open. He didn't tell her to go back. She didn't ask whether she was welcome. She stood on the far side of the step and looked up in the way her grandfather had taught her, not analyzing, just receiving. After a while, she said, "He used to say they were the Creator's way of showing off, Joe," Callum said. "Yes," a pause. He said, "If you're ever feeling too important, just wait for a clear night in November." Callum looked up. The lights moved in that slow, massive way that makes the usual scale of things feel temporary. He had watched them from this same step for over a decade without feeling anything but cold. Tonight, for the first time in a long time, he felt something he didn't have a name for. "He talked about you," she said. "He said you were the only person on that fencing contract who treated him like the work spoke for itself. He said you were fair and you didn't pretend the day was easier than it was. He was generous. He was specific," she said. And the way she said it, not as flattery but as evidence, made him turn and look at her. She was watching the lights with the same attention she gave the fencing and the hydraulics and the bannock dough, the attention of someone trying to understand a thing fully, not perform understanding of it. "What are you going to do?" he said. "After the season, where will you go?" She was quiet for a moment. "I don't know," she said. "I had a plan until about 8 months ago. Then the job offers didn't come and the plan stopped making sense." A pause. "I think I'm looking for somewhere that feels like it could actually be mine. Not borrowed, not provisional." She looked at the lights. "I haven't found it yet." Callum said nothing, but something in his chest moved quietly, like a door that has been closed so long it's forgotten it was ever meant to open. What gets me about that moment isn't anything romantic. It's a man standing outside his own house in the dark, looking up and actually being present for it. 11 years is a long time to look at the northern lights and feel nothing but the cold. He went inside without saying good night. He never did. But that night, for the first time in 11 years, he stood at the window for a few minutes before he turned the light off. They drove into Moose Jaw together on a Saturday in late November for supplies. Callum had been quietly dreading it. Moose Jaw is not an unkind town, but it is an observant one, and people who had known Callum Bryce for 20 years would have things to say to each other about the young indigenous woman in the passenger seat of his truck. He could feel the calibration happening as they walked through the co-op, some curious, some carefully neutral, some doing the math in real time. Near the hardware aisle, a man named Glenn Doucette, large, slow-moving, entirely certain of his standing, appeared beside the feed displays. "That your new helper, Callum?" he said. He looked at Vera with the particular expression of a man taking inventory of something he's decided doesn't belong. Callum stopped. He felt Vera go still beside him with the practiced stillness of someone who has been through this particular doorway before and knows exactly how wide it is. He turned to look at Doucette with the flatness of a man who has made a decision before the sentence was finished. "She's the best equipment mechanic and fence builder in the county," Callum said, "and you're standing between me and the chain connectors." Doucette looked from Callum to Vera and back. He stepped aside. They finished the shopping without further event. On the drive home, the silence was different from the silences that had come before it, warmer and more complicated and occupying more of the cab. "You didn't need to do that," Vera said. "I know. Why did you?" He watched the road. The fields on either side were white and flat and going a long way in every direction. "Because it was accurate," he said, "and because some things need to be said in front of witnesses." She looked at him for a moment. Then she turned back to the road. In a diner on the edge of town, a man neither of them had noticed, seated by the window with a coffee he'd been nursing for an hour, took out his phone. On a Sunday afternoon in the 7th week, Callum came in from the barn to find Vera's field notebook open on the kitchen table. He hadn't meant to look, but what he saw stopped him where he stood. It wasn't a field notebook, or rather it was. The first third was fencing measurements, soil notes, equipment observations, all in a precise technical hand. But the back 2/3 were something else entirely. Sketches, done in pencil with the kind of detail that takes more than skill, that takes care. The north field fence line she'd built, caught in the low angle of November light, each post throwing its small shadow east. The tractor in the shed with its panels open, rendered with the accuracy of someone who understood what she was drawing from the inside. A hawk she must have watched for a long time, suspended over the property in the particular set of its wings that means it's found the thermal and is choosing to stay. And one drawing of the homestead itself, the house and the barn and the space between them, with the single old spruce at the northwest corner that Callum's father had planted the year he filed the claim. She had caught the exact lean of it. The way it listed slightly into the prevailing wind, as if it had been arguing with the same direction for 70 years and had settled into a kind of grudging accommodation. She was standing in the kitchen doorway when he looked up. He waited for her to be embarrassed. She wasn't. "Joe taught me," she said. "He said if you can draw a thing accurately, you've actually looked at it." She came to the table. "Most people look at a place and see what they expect. Drawing makes you see what's there." Callum picked up the sketch of the spruce. He looked at it for a long time. She had drawn it as a living thing with a history, not a tree, but a decision that had been made in 1949 and was still standing by it. "You've been paying attention," he said. "That's what I'm here for." He set the sketch down carefully. Then he said, without quite planning to, "Could you draw something for me?" She looked at him for a moment, the way she looked at the fence line before she decided where to start. "I already know what," she said. She gave it to him 4 days later. It was the equipment shed. But the way she had drawn it, it wasn't a shed. It was a specific afternoon. The light coming in low through the west-facing doors, the tractor repaired and standing cleanly in its bay, tools on the wall in the order she'd established. And in the foreground, just visible at the edge of the frame, 2 pairs of work boots side by side on the mat. His, worn and resolute. Hers, steel-toed and newer. That evening she wasn't at supper. He found her outside by the spruce with her back to the house and her knees drawn up, looking at the field with her face doing something she clearly hadn't meant him to see. "Vera." She looked up. Her eyes were wet, not weeping, just the aftermath of something she'd been holding at a reasonable distance until she couldn't. "I need to tell you something," she said. "Something my grandfather didn't put in the letter because he knew if he did, you wouldn't have agreed to any of this." Callum sat down on the frozen ground beside the spruce. He waited. She looked at her hands. "I'm not just looking for seasonal work. A man named Dale Hewson, he administers land and agricultural claims in this part of the province, told me last spring that the only practical way for an Indigenous woman without an established credit history to hold any recognized working status in rural Saskatchewan is to be formally attached to a registered agricultural operation." She paused. I have until the end of December to establish that, or he reclassifies me as a non-resident worker, which means I lose my eligibility for the agricultural credential I've been working toward for 4 years. What happens if you lose it? Callum said carefully. I start over. Somewhere else. Probably Alberta. She said it without drama, which made it harder to hear than dramatics would have been. Callum was quiet for a long time. Why didn't Joe tell me that? She looked up. Her voice was steady and sad and something else. Something that was not pride exactly, but was close to its root. Because he wanted you to want me here, she said. Not feel obligated to keep me here. This is the part of the story I keep coming back to. Joe Lonechild was dying, and he wrote a letter that left out the most important fact. Because he trusted Callum Bryce, a man he hadn't seen in 9 years, to choose the right thing freely. That is not a small trust. I think about that a lot. Callum looked at the drawing he'd been carrying in his jacket pocket for 2 days, the 2 pairs of boots on the mat. He didn't say anything, but he didn't put it away. He didn't sleep much that night. He lay in the dark thinking about all the decisions he had made since Marion, not to do things, not to take on a farmhand, not to attend the community harvest dinner, not to answer the phone the first time his daughter called after a longer than usual gap. He had framed all of it as protection. Of himself, of the quiet, of the careful machinery of getting through the days without anything additional going wrong. Somewhere around 2 in the morning, he admitted something to himself he'd been refusing to look at for weeks. He did not want her to leave. It wasn't obligation, though Joe's letter had started the whole thing. It wasn't gratitude, though there was that too. It was something that had grown in the daily work. In the way she fixed things properly instead of getting them through the season, in the way she watched the northern lights without needing to explain herself, in the way she had looked at the spruce tree his father planted and seen a decision instead of just a tree. He was afraid of it, the way you're afraid of a river. You know you need to cross and have been avoiding by walking the long way round for 11 years. The following morning he drove into town alone. He went to the provincial agricultural office on Main Street and asked about Hewson's claim. The clerk confirmed it and then added quietly that the reclassification could be challenged if the individual in question was formally employed on a registered operation with documented tenure. There's a few ways to establish that, the clerk said. A formal employment contract, notarized. She paused. Or a marriage record which supersedes the work designation entirely. Callum drove home the long way, along the field roads, letting the truck find its pace through the flat white afternoon. By the time he reached his own gate, he knew what he was going to say. Not because of Hewson, not because of the clerk, not because of Joe, though Joe had started it, but because he had spent 11 years being a man who had stopped wanting things, and he was, quietly, reluctantly, undeniably, finished with that. He found her resetting a corner post on the east fence line. "Vera," he said. She turned. Her breath made a small cloud in the cold air. She waited with the patience of someone who has learned that waiting is not the same as losing. For the first time in 11 years, Callum Bryce said something he had not planned and could not take back. "I don't want you to go." She didn't answer right away. She set the post driver down in the snow. A breath, a moment. "What does that mean?" she said. "Not suspicious, not hopeful, just careful. It means this place works better with you in it. It means I sleep better knowing there's someone on the other side of the wall." He looked at the fence line she'd built, clean and true in the winter light. "It means the drawing you gave me is the first thing I've looked at in years that made me feel like I was still part of what was happening here, not just maintaining it. Part of it." He was quiet for a moment. "It means I've been alone long enough that I'd almost convinced myself I preferred it, and I don't think that's true anymore." She looked at the field. Her hands were in her gloves, and her jaw was set in the way of someone managing something carefully. "I told myself this wouldn't happen," she said. "So did I. I came here for work. A season. That was the whole thing." "I know." She looked at him then, fully, the way she had looked at the spruce tree before she drew it, finding the actual shape beneath the surface. "I don't know what I am to you," she said. I don't know the word. Neither do I, he said honestly. But I think the word comes after you decide, not before. A long silence. The wind moved through the dry grass under the snow with a sound that was almost patient. My grandfather said you were a good man, she said quietly. He was too generous. He was never too generous, she said. It wasn't in him. She turned back to the post. I'll think about it, she said. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't the thing he'd been afraid of. And for the first time in 11 years, Callum Bryce drove back to his house afraid of something that wasn't loss. That was new. That was, tentatively, almost good. Hewson came on a Wednesday in December with a colleague he introduced as an administrative associate and a printed form he held with the authority of someone who has confused paperwork for power. Callum had seen the truck from the window and was already at the gate when they came up the drive. Hewson walked past him toward the east fence line, where Vera was working, which told Callum everything he needed to know about what kind of man Hewson was. Miss Lonechild. Hewson's voice carried the particular flatness of someone performing a function. The end-of-year designation review is this Friday. Your arrangement here is informal and undocumented. I'll need you to. She's not going anywhere. Hewson stopped. Callum had not moved fast. He was simply suddenly between Hewson and Vera, his voice carrying the absolute quiet of a man who has finished deliberating. Mr. Bryce, this is an administrative matter regarding a non-permanent. My fiancée, Callum said. The word landed in the December air between all of them. He heard Vera go very still behind him. Hewson looked from Callum to Vera and back. He reassessed. He was the kind of man who understood changed circumstances. I'll need documentation, Hewson said, retreating into process. You'll have it before Friday. Hewson and his colleague left. The truck went back down the drive and out onto the road. Callum turned around. Vera was looking at him with an expression he couldn't categorize, not angry, not grateful, and not quite amused, though all three were present somewhere at the edges. Your fiancé, she said. I know I should have asked first. Yes, she said, you should have. A pause. The field stretched away behind her, white and enormous and quietly attentive. Then, ask me now, he asked her, not on his knee. That wasn't either of their styles. Standing in the cold between the fence she had built and the house his grandfather had framed, with the spruce tree at the corner doing its patient work against the wind. I'm not an easy person to live with, he said. I'm quiet in a way that can feel like distance. I've spent 11 years building a life around one person being here, and I'm not sure I know yet how to build it around two. But I can tell you this. He looked at her. I will see you every day for the rest of my life, and I will actually see you. Not look at where you're supposed to be. See you. I think that's worth something. She looked at him for a long time. My grandfather knew, she said. He always knew. Yes, Callum said. He was. She looked down at the snow. Looked up. So am I, she said. I know. And I think, she said, and stopped. She took a breath that made a small, brief cloud in the cold. I think the answer is yes. They were married in January at the Moose Jaw Courthouse, small and without ceremony, with the clerk who had quietly helped Callum understand his options serving as the official, and their nearest neighbor, an older Métis woman named Colette Aubert, who had been bringing them casseroles since October with the serene confidence of someone who had seen this coming, as witness. Colette cried, which surprised everyone, including Colette. The homestead changed after that. Not quickly, and not in any single visible way. The fourth bedroom became a studio. Vera moved her sketchbooks in and a proper drafting table she'd found in a Saskatoon warehouse for $300. The kitchen began to smell like two people's cooking instead of one. The truck that had been a single man's truck became something else, something that held two people's plans for the day and the easy negotiation of who needed it when. The silence that had lived in every room like a second occupant was replaced, slowly, by the ordinary sounds of a house that had remembered what it was for. In the spring, March, when the snow was starting to make its reluctant concessions and the fields had begun to remember they were fields, Vera found him at the equipment shed on a Saturday morning, and she told him the way she told him everything that mattered. simply, directly, without preamble. He stood very still. Then he crossed the space between them and held her, not with words, just held her in the way a man holds something he had been quietly terrified he would never have. Not dramatically, not like a scene, but like a fact he was still learning the size of. Outside, the March light came over the fields in the long, particular way it does in Saskatchewan, when the season is just beginning to turn, low and golden and suggesting, not yet promising. The spruce at the corner of the yard stood as it had always stood, listing into the prevailing wind, having long since made its peace with the direction things came from. Callum Bryce had spent 11 years being a man who had stopped building things. It turned out he wasn't done. And somewhere in the cold, bright distance, or perhaps only in the place where a grandfather's love outlasts the body that carried it, Joe Lonechild was right about everything he'd been right about all along.